today we are going to take a look at flying geese and learn a few tips and tricks to make them look a little better in your piecing. So today I thought I would spend some time and show you how to create flying geese. First, we'll talk about how to make a single flying geese and the best way to trim it so that our points stay where they need to be and it stays nice and centered, and we don't knock off that point, which is often why people hate flying geese in general. And then I'll come back and I'll show you how to make 4 flying geese at one time so that you can be a little bit more efficient, because oftentimes we're making lots of flying geese for one little piece. So let's take a look at what we need. For our flying geese, you need 2 pieces that will be the pieces that we add to the base that create the angle that we need on our flying geese. I am going to make a 2" by 4" flying geese today, and at the end of the video we'll have a chart that shows you the different cuts that you'll need for each of the pieces to make different size flying geese. So to get us started, what we need to do is actually take and flip over the 2 pieces that we'll be adding to the base and draw a diagonal across them. Then we're going to take and match one of them across our base piece, and we're going to sew on the diagonal of that one. You can't put both on at the same time, so we have to add one first. We're going to sew, we'll flip this piece back, and then we'll add the next one. So let's go over to the sewing machine and get this first part sewn. Here I am at the sewing machine ready to sew down this line that we just created. I will add that if you will sew just to the inside, right against the line, so we're not going to sew right through the line, but we're going to sew just against it. Not even enough to make the thread really show between the two. But if you will sew towards the outside of that line just a little bit, it gives you a little bit more room here to press this back, and it looks a little nicer. If you struggle with that, you can sew right on the line, and it sometimes ends up being just the tiniest bit short, which you would catch in your seam anyway. But if we're working to make better flying geese, we're going to sew just against the line on the right hand side. So now that we have our line sewn, you can see that my stitching is still the line here is a little dark because I'm up against it and not all the way through it. We're going to take it over to the cutting mat. We'll cut a 1/4 inch here, and then we're going to take and actually press this back over to start creating that flying geese. Now we want to get rid of this excess out here that would be bulk in our seam. So we're going to take our 1/4 inch mark on our ruler, so just that first mark on our ruler, and we're going to lay that on the diagonal of the flying geese where we just sewed through this side. And we're just going to cut the fabric off. That way we've left ourselves that 1/4 inch seam that we would have normally if we had sewn this by putting the block pieces together. So now I'm just going to take it over to the iron and actually press this back. One thing that I wanted to mention while we're pressing is that it's helpful if you set the seam. And to set the seam, what we really are doing is pressing heat against this side of our fabric before we flip it and press it on this side. So I'm going to set my seam by just putting a little heat on it. That makes the fabric a little bit more pliable, and it kind of tightens up the stitches a little bit here. Then we're going to press that back, and we're really trying to press the block and not iron it. So ironing is when we're like back and forth on something. When we're trying to get these pieces to work out better for us, we're just pressing on the fabric to get it to lay down flat. Okay, so then after this cools off for just a minute, because the ink on our fabric is one that is erasable with heat, you don't want to lay it against it and then have your line erase. So after it's a little bit cooler to the touch, now we're going to take it back to the sewing machine and add the other side. angling it so that when we press this back, we get that triangle piece here in the center. Okay, so let's take it over to the sewing machine and we'll sew the other side. When I go to add the other side of the fabric to this Flying Geese, I like to start on the end that's away from the point. That way, as we sew, it presses this seam back away from us. If we start the other direction, sometimes this back piece tries to flip and we have a turn in our seam, which we don't like to see when we're piecing. So I will start at the far end and then come back down into that V. Okay, so again, I'm just barely to the right-hand side of that line. So then we're gonna do the same thing where we trim and press this piece back. Okay, so we're gonna take our ruler, lay that 1/4 inch line on the seam that we just sewed through, and trim off the excess. Okay, on our pressing, we're gonna set that seam, get it nice and warm, and then press that fabric back, making sure to press and not really iron over it. There we have our Flying Geese. Now what we need to do is actually square up our piece before we add it to any of our quilting. So to do that, what's really important here is that we keep this point in the center of our block, and that these angles come out at 45 degrees. So I like to use my little OmniGrid 2.5 by 8 inch ruler. It has a 45-degree mark on it. And what we can do is actually lay that 45-degree mark on one of the diagonals of our Flying Geese. And then we want to make sure that we have a 1/4 inch seam at this point. So we're gonna take and make sure that we have our 1/4 inch mark on the point where these fabrics come together, and that I have the diagonal on one of the sides here. And let me flip this around so I'll have it under the whole, my Flying Geese under the whole piece. So I have my 1/4 inch here on that point. I have my 45-degree mark lined up with one of my diagonals, and then I'm just going to trim the little bit that we have here off. For the chart that we'll have at the end, you don't have much to trim off, so you can always add just a little bit more to the dimensions of each of these pieces, so you have a little bit more to trim off if you're new and struggle with getting these to look great. So then I'm gonna flip it over to the other side. I'm gonna lay my ruler back on it. Again, I'm lining up that seam. And for ours, since I'm making a 2x4 Flying Geese, then this should be the 2.5 that we need. That's what I really like about this ruler when we're doing 2x4 Flying Geese. Okay. All right. Next, we need this to be 4.5 inches wide for this one. So I'm going to take, and that point, if this whole thing should be 4.5 inches wide, then this point should be halfway in the middle, which is 2 1/4. So I'm going to take and line up with the bottom, and then I'm just going to make sure that my 2 1/4 is there on the mark here. And then we'll trim that up. And again, we don't have much to trim up, but it'll help us be more square later if we'll take the time to do it. Flip it over. This time I'm lining up with my edges, making sure I'm at 4.5 here, and then trimming up anything that's left on this side. Okay, and there we have a Flying Geese that has the 1/4 inch seam above our point so that we don't knock off this point right here when we're sewing it into our quilt. And coming down here on the sides, we have these meeting at 45-degree angles so that our block doesn't end up a little bit turned when we get all the pieces laid in together. So that's the best way that you can make a Flying Geese and have all of them look perfect together. Let's take a look at making 4 at one time. Now that we know how to make a flying geese, let's take a look at making 4 at one time and be a little bit more efficient with our time. To get started with making 4 at one time, we're going to start by placing the fabric that we're adding right sides together. And you can see here that, again, I've used an erasable pen and made a mark down the diagonal of that square. And we're going to stack 2 of them at the same time. And you can see that the diagonals line up, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that line on both sides. So I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew our 1/4 inch. This time we're sewing a 1/4 inch away from the diagonal line we drew. So I need to make my machine have a 1/4 inch seam. So on the Baby Lock Altair, I'm going to go to my quilt stitches and I'm going to pick stitch number 2. That moves my needle over so that the edge of my J-foot becomes my 1/4 inch away from where the needle is in that position. This time around, what we're going to do is we're going to take the line that we drew and we're going to lay it against the inside edge of our J-foot. The needle has moved over so that the distance from this line to where it's going to stitch is a 1/4 inch. If you don't have one of the Baby Lock machines, just take a scrap piece of fabric and draw a line on it, and then draw another line that's a 1/4 inch away, and make sure that your needle lines up with that 1/4 inch. It's really important that we have that good 1/4 inch seam when we're sewing these pieces. Okay, I'm just going to turn around and go again down the other side so that I have another line of sewing that's a 1/4 inch from that diagonal. So we're going to have 2 lines of sewing on either side of that diagonal line. Okay, there we have our 2 stitching lines. We're going to go and actually cut down this diagonal line now so that we have 2 separate pieces. I'm just going to take my ruler and lay it on the diagonal that we drew through those 2 pieces and cut through it. Now we have 2 pieces and we need to go and press both of these little flaps up so we get this little heart shape. And then we'll add each of these to the points here at the bottom. So let's iron our pieces first. Just like we did with the single flying geese, we're going to set our seam. Okay, and then we're going to just press those flaps back. Okay, we'll do that for the other piece as well. Set the seam. Flip these guys back. All right, then for each of these pieces, we're going to take the 2 fabrics that we haven't used yet, face them right sides together, so we should see the back of the fabric here, and that diagonal line is going to be running up between the 2 points. And again, we're going to take that over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that diagonal line. I still have my sewing machine set so that the edge of my foot is a 1/4 inch away from where the needle is going to sew. When you sew that line, you should see that this stitching comes up and meets right at that point. That means we've done a really good job to keep a 1/4 inch seam. Then we'll do the same thing to our other piece. Okay, all we have to do is take it over to the cutting mat and cut these pieces apart. Just like we did before, we will cut down that diagonal line. And then all we have to do is press back our other side. After you get all 4 of those pieces pressed, Then you would go through the same process as we did with the single flying geese in trimming them up and making sure that we use our 45-degree on our ruler and make sure that that point is a good 1/4 inch away from the top of the flying geese. Here is a table of values that you can use to make different size flying geese. You can see on the left-hand side that you have your finished height and width, and then you have there in the middle the 4 little pieces that you would need for creating 4 flying geese at one time, and the larger base piece is there on the right. Here is a table that you can use for making a single flying geese at a time. Notice there on the left you have your finished height and width, and then in the center would be the 2 pieces that we're adding to our base, and over on the right is the size of the base fabric that you'll need for each of your flying geese. Hopefully some of those tips and tricks help you have perfect looking flying geese for your next piecing project. Thanks for joining us. If you liked what you saw today, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to receive those notifications, make sure you click on the bell icon. Thanks for letting us turn your inspiration into a creation.